At 61, Margaret Hale believed the hardest years of her life were already behind her. For more than 3 decades, she had cared for her family, raised 2 children, and turned an ordinary house into a place filled with memories. She knew every creaking stair, every crack in the kitchen wall, and every rosebush she had planted by hand. She also believed the life she had built belonged to both of them. Then, on a cold morning in early March, her husband placed a folder on the kitchen table. "I want a divorce," he said. There was no shouting, no long explanation. Only the calm voice of a man who had prepared for that moment long before she knew anything was wrong. Margaret stared at the papers. Her name, their marriage, and more than 30 years of life together had been reduced to legal terms and carefully arranged numbers. The house had belonged to her husband's family before their marriage. Years earlier, when he refinanced it, Margaret had signed the documents he placed in front of her without questioning them. She had trusted him. Now she learned that her name had never been added to the deed. Most of their savings had also been moved from the joint account during the previous year. Even the car was registered solely in his name. Her lawyer said she could challenge the transfers and fight for a fair settlement. But the case could take months, perhaps longer, and legal fees would begin immediately. Margaret had only a small personal savings account. Her husband had time, money, and documents she had never known existed. 3 weeks later, while the lawyers were still exchanging letters, he stood at the bottom of the stairs and told her she needed to leave. Margaret looked at the man she had trusted with every financial decision for most of her adult life. "You planned this," she said. He did not deny it. She packed 2 suitcases, a box of family photographs, and her father's old pocket watch. At the front door, she looked back at the living room, where birthdays, Christmas mornings, and family dinners had once filled the house with noise. Everything was still there. Only she no longer belonged. Outside, Margaret sat behind the wheel of a borrowed truck, uncertain where she would sleep the next night. Then she felt something heavy in the pocket of her coat, an old iron key. It belonged to her father's abandoned mill, a place no one in the family had mentioned for nearly 20 years. Margaret closed her hand around it. The mill was not a home, but it was the only place left where no one had the right to tell her to leave. Margaret drove for nearly 4 hours before the highway narrowed into the country road she remembered from childhood. The town looked smaller than it had in her memory. The grocery store had a new sign, the old gas station was gone, and several storefronts along Main Street stood empty. But the hills beyond the town had not changed. Neither had the river that curved behind her father's mill. By late afternoon, she reached the end of a gravel road overgrown with weeds. The mill stood in silence. Its wooden siding had faded to gray. Several windows were broken, one corner of the roof had collapsed, and vines had climbed halfway up the stone foundation. The sign above the entrance still carried the family name, though most of the paint had peeled away. Margaret turned off the engine and remained in the truck. She had not been there since her father's funeral. For years, the building had been too painful to visit. It reminded her of flour dust on his sleeves, the sound of grain pouring through wooden chutes, and the way he always claimed the mill could outlive all of them if someone cared for it properly. Now it looked as though no one had. Margaret stepped out and crossed the yard. Dry grass brushed against her boots. At the door, she pulled the old iron key from her coat pocket. It took several attempts before the lock finally turned. The smell inside was a mixture of dust, damp wood, and rust. Sunlight entered through cracks in the walls, revealing abandoned sacks, broken crates, and machinery hidden beneath heavy canvas covers. The main room was colder than the air outside. Margaret walked slowly between the machines until she found the small office at the back. Her father's desk was still there. So was his chair, a metal lunchbox, and a calendar left open to a month nearly 20 years earlier. She ran her fingers across the desk and left a clean line through the dust. For the first time since leaving her home, Margaret allowed herself to cry, not because the mill was ruined, because it had waited for her. She opened the truck, carried in her 2 suitcases, and placed them beside the office wall. That night, she would sleep on an old folding cot beneath her father's roof. It was cold, broken, and almost forgotten. but no one could force her out of it. The next morning, Margaret woke before sunrise. Cold air slipped through the broken windows, and every movement in the old mill echoed through the empty rooms. She wrapped herself in her coat, heated water on a small camping stove, and drank coffee from a chipped enamel cup she found in one of the cabinets. In daylight, the damage looked worse. The floorboards near the western wall had begun to rot. Rain had stained the ceiling. Rust covered the gears, and several belts had cracked with age. The loading area was filled with broken crates, mouse nests, and sacks of grain that had hardened into useless lumps. Margaret stood in the center of the main room and wondered whether coming back had been a mistake. She had no crew, no proper tools, and very little money. Still, she picked up a broom. For the next several hours, she swept dust, dragged out ruined sacks, and uncovered the machines one by one. Beneath the canvas sheets stood the equipment she remembered from childhood: the stone grinder, the wooden sifters, the grain elevator, and the large iron wheel connected to the water system outside. Most of it looked dead, but not all of it looked beyond saving. Near noon, Margaret entered her father's office again. She opened drawers filled with old receipts, faded photographs, and rusted pencils. At the bottom of a locked cabinet, she found a narrow wooden box. Inside were 3 leather-bound notebooks. The pages were yellow, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her father had recorded everything. He wrote about grain suppliers, repair costs, customer orders, weather patterns, and the different ways wheat behaved in heat, rain, and cold. Some pages contained flour blends, others included sketches of machinery and notes about adjustments he had made over the years. Margaret turned the pages slowly. This was more than an old business record. It was a map of how the mill had once lived. Then she found a sentence underlined twice. "A mill does not fail when the wheel stops. It fails when no one remembers how to start it again." Margaret read the line more than once. Outside, the river continued moving behind the building, just as it had when her father was alive. She closed the notebook and looked through the dirty window toward the silent water wheel. For the first time, she did not see a ruin. She saw instructions. For the next 3 days, Margaret studied her father's notebooks and compared every drawing with the machines around her. Most of the equipment was covered in rust, but the damage was not as complete as she had first believed. The wooden sifters were dry but intact. Several gears still moved when she pushed them by hand. Even the main grinding stones showed fewer cracks than expected. The water wheel was the greatest question. It had not turned in nearly 20 years. Margaret cleared branches and mud from the narrow channel that once guided water toward it. Beneath the weeds, she found the old stone walls still holding their shape. The wooden paddles were worn, but the iron center remained solid. She needed someone who understood the system. In town, she was given the name of Walter Reed, a retired mechanic who had once worked beside her father. He was 82 and lived alone in a small house near the railway tracks. When Margaret explained what she had found, Walter stared at her for a long moment. "Your father said that mill would run again someday," he finally said. The next morning, Walter arrived carrying a metal toolbox and walking with a cane. He inspected the gears, tested the shafts, and tapped the iron fittings with a small hammer. Margaret followed him from machine to machine, waiting for his judgment. At last, Walter wiped his hands on a cloth. "It is damaged," he said, "but it is not dead." He explained that the machinery had been built from heavy iron, hardwood, and stone. Unlike newer equipment designed for speed, the old system had been made to operate slowly and survive years of repair. The main axle would need new bearings, several belts had to be replaced. The water wheel required fresh paddles and careful balancing. But the heart of the mill was still there. Walter turned one of the smaller gears. It resisted at first, then moved with a deep metallic groan. Another gear shifted beside it. The sound echoed through the building. Margaret felt something rise in her chest. It was not the sound of a working mill. Not yet. But it was the first sound the old machines had made in decades. Walter looked at her and gave a small smile. "You do not need to rebuild everything," he said. "You only need to wake up what still works." For the first time since arriving, Margaret believed the mill might truly have a future. Margaret spent the next week calculating what it would take to bring the mill back to life. She listed every repair Walter had mentioned: new bearings, replacement belts, roof work, wiring, cleaning equipment, and enough grain for the first test run. Even after cutting every unnecessary expense, the total was far more than she could afford. Still, the idea had taken hold. She did not want to restore the mill as a museum. She wanted it to work again. Her plan was simple: buy wheat, corn, and barley from nearby farms, grind them slowly with the old stones, and sell fresh flour to local bakeries, restaurants, and families. Walter warned her that the work would be difficult. People are used to cheap flour, he said. They may not care how it is made. Margaret looked at her father's notebooks. Then I will give them a reason to care. She took her plan to the only bank in town. The loan officer listened politely while she explained the mill, the equipment, and the growing interest in locally produced food. When she finished, he folded his hands on the desk. "You are 61, he said. "The building has been abandoned for 2 decades, and you have no recent business experience." Margaret felt her face grow warm. "The mill is paid for," she replied. "The machinery can be repaired." "The machinery is old," he said, "and sentiment is not a business model." Her application was denied before the end of the day. News spread quickly through the town. Some people admired her courage, but others shook their heads. They said she was grieving, desperate, or too proud to accept that the mill's time had passed. Then her former husband called. He had heard about her plan from a mutual friend. "A flour mill?" he said with a laugh. "Margaret, you could barely manage the household accounts." She remained silent. "You should sell the property before it costs you everything," he continued. "At your age, you need security, not another failure." Margaret looked across the room at the iron gears, the stone grinder, and the notebooks open on her father's desk. For years, she had allowed other people to define what she was capable of. Not anymore. "I did not call for your advice," she said, and ended the conversation. That evening, Margaret opened her savings records. The amount was small, but it was hers. She circled the number with a pen. It was not enough to restore the entire mill, but it was enough to begin. Margaret began with the repairs she could afford. She bought second-hand belts, paid a roofer to patch the worst leaks, and worked beside Walter to clean years of rust from the gears. For 2 weeks, they tightened bolts, replaced damaged boards, and cleared the channel leading water toward the wheel. Every dollar came from Margaret's savings. She stopped buying anything that was not essential. She slept on the folding cot, cooked simple meals on the camping stove, and kept every receipt inside an old metal box. At last, the day came for the first test. A nearby farmer agreed to sell her a small load of wheat at a reduced price. Margaret inspected the grain, but she had been away from the milling business for too long to notice that it still held too much moisture from recent rain. Walter helped release water into the restored channel. Slowly, the wheel began to move. The first turn was uneven. Then it gathered strength, pulling the main shaft into motion. Inside the mill, gears groaned, belts tightened, and the old grinding stones began to rotate. Margaret stood beside the hopper with tears in her eyes. For a few moments, everything worked. Then the sound changed. The stones began to strain. Instead of falling as soft flour, the wheat formed warm, sticky clumps. The damp grain clogged the wooden chute and pressed between the stones. Walter shouted for her to stop the wheel. By the time the machinery fell silent, much of the wheat had been ruined. One belt had slipped loose, and the grinding chamber was packed with a heavy paste that took hours to remove. Margaret stared at the wasted grain spread across the floor. It had cost nearly all the money she had reserved for supplies. Walter told her the machines had done what they were supposed to do. The problem was the grain. But Margaret barely heard him. She had ignored the doubts of the bank, the town, and her former husband. Now, on her very first attempt, she had failed in exactly the way they predicted. That night, she sat alone in her father's office with the ruined flour in a paper bag beside her. For the first time, she considered selling the mill. Then her eyes fell on the 3 notebooks. Margaret opened the first one and began reading again, this time not as a daughter searching for memories, but as a miller searching for the mistake she had made. Margaret read until nearly dawn. Page after page, her father had written about details she had once considered unimportant: the smell of properly dried wheat, the sound grain made when shaken in a metal scoop, and the way flour changed when the grinding stones became too warm. Then she found a section marked with a red line. "Never trust the surface of the grain," her father had written. "A dry shell can hide moisture inside." Below it was a simple testing method. He would place a handful of wheat in a sealed glass jar overnight. If condensation appeared inside the glass by morning, the grain was not ready to grind. Margaret looked at the bag of ruined wheat beside her. The failure had not come from the old machinery. It had come from something she had failed to understand. The next morning, she visited the farmer who had sold her the grain. Rather than accuse him, she asked whether she could inspect the remaining wheat stored in his barn. Recent rain had delayed the harvest, and the grain had been stored before it was fully dry. Margaret bought only a small amount this time. She spread it across wooden trays inside the mill and allowed warm air to move through it for several days. Every morning, she tested a sample using her father's glass jar method. Walter watched her work without interrupting. On the fourth morning, the glass remained clear. They cleaned the grinding chamber, adjusted the distance between the stones, and released water into the channel again. The wheel began to turn. Margaret poured the wheat slowly into the hopper. This time the stones moved without strain. A pale stream of flour fell into the wooden bin below. It was soft, dry, and warm, but not hot. Margaret lifted a handful to her face. The flour carried a faint, nutty scent she remembered from childhood. Walter rubbed some between his fingers and smiled. "That is how your father's flour used to feel." They had produced only 3 small sacks, but Margaret treated them like treasure. Her first attempt had nearly ended the dream. Her second had taught her what the mill demanded: patience, attention, and respect for details that could not be rushed. That evening, Margaret wrote her first entry in a new notebook. "The machines were not too old," she wrote. "I was simply moving too fast." Margaret knew 3 sacks of flour would not save the mill. She needed someone willing to try them. The next morning, she carried 1 sack into town and stopped at Miller's Bakery, a small shop that had served the community for nearly 40 years. Its owner, Daniel Miller, listened as Margaret explained how the wheat had been dried, tested, and ground slowly between the old stones. Daniel looked at the plain cloth sack. "I already have a supplier," he said. "I'm not asking you to replace them," Margaret replied. "Just bake 1 batch." He finally agreed to take enough flour for 12 loaves. Margaret returned to the mill and waited. 2 days passed without a call. By the 3rd morning, she had convinced herself that the flour had made no difference. Then Daniel's truck appeared outside. He entered carrying half a loaf wrapped in brown paper. "You need to taste this," he said. The crust was darker than usual, and the inside had a soft, golden color. Margaret tore off a piece. The bread had a warm, slightly nutty flavor and a texture that felt richer than bread made with ordinary commercial flour. Daniel placed the loaf on her father's desk. "My customers noticed," he said. 3 of them asked what I had changed. He ordered 10 sacks. Margaret's excitement quickly turned to worry. 10 sacks were more than she had produced since reopening the mill. Daniel gave her 1 week. For the next 7 days, Margaret and Walter worked from before sunrise until late evening. A nearby farmer supplied properly dried wheat. Margaret tested every batch, adjusted the stones, and recorded each result in her notebook. The mill filled with sound again, turning gears, moving belts, flowing water, and grain falling through wooden chutes. They completed the order with only hours to spare. A week later, Daniel returned for 20 more sacks. Then a restaurant called. After that came another bakery from the neighboring town. The orders were still small, but they were real. Each one paid for grain, repairs, and another step forward. Margaret pinned the first paid invoice above her father's desk. The bank had seen an abandoned building. Her former husband had seen another failure. But one baker had tasted the flour and recognized that the old mill could produce something the modern factories had forgotten. Within 6 months, the mill no longer felt abandoned. Farm trucks arrived each morning carrying wheat, corn, and barley from nearby fields. The empty storage room became a packing area, and the old loading platform was repaired so orders could be collected without interrupting production. Margaret could no longer manage everything alone. She hired Lena, a single mother from town, to handle orders and accounts. A young farmer named Caleb began helping Walter maintain the machinery. 2 local women came in several days a week to weigh flour, seal bags, and prepare baking mixes. Every new employee brought another part of the building back to life. Margaret also made an agreement with several small farmers. She promised to pay a fair price for grain that met her quality standards. In return, they agreed to dry, store, and deliver it carefully. Soon, the mill was producing stone-ground wheat flour, cornmeal, barley flour, and bread mixes based on recipes found in her father's notebooks. Customers began visiting in person. Some came to buy flour, others came simply to see the waterwheel turning. Margaret opened the mill on Saturdays, allowing families to watch grain travel from the hopper to the grinding stones and into finished sacks. The building the town had once considered worthless became one of its busiest places. Then Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Her former husband arrived in a polished car and walked through the front door as though he had been invited. He looked at the shelves of packaged flour, the workers filling orders, and the line of customers near the counter. "I heard you are doing well," he said. Margaret waited. He explained that he knew people who could help the mill expand. With investment, they could install faster equipment, increase production, and distribute the flour across the state. Then he offered to become her business partner. For a moment, Margaret remembered the morning he had placed the divorce papers on the kitchen table. She remembered leaving with 2 suitcases while he warned her that the mill would become another failure. "This mill does not need someone who believes in it after it succeeds," she said. "It needed someone who believed in it when it was still covered in dust." His smile disappeared. Margaret opened the door for him. After he left, the water wheel continued turning. She returned to the packing table, where a new order from 3 neighboring towns was waiting. The mill had once been the only place she could go. Now it had become a place where other people could build new lives. 1 year after Margaret first unlocked the abandoned mill, the town gathered for its official reopening. Fresh paint covered the wooden walls, the broken windows had been replaced, and her father's old sign hung above the entrance once again. Beneath the family name, Margaret had added a simple line, "Stone-ground flour since 1948. Farmers parked their trucks along the gravel road. Families filled the yard, children leaned over the railing to watch the river, and the smell of warm bread drifted from tables set near the entrance. Inside, the machinery waited in silence. Walter stood beside the main lever, wearing the cleanest work shirt Margaret had ever seen him wear. Lena arranged the first bags of flour on the shelves, while Caleb checked the belts and bearings one final time. Margaret stepped in front of the crowd. For a moment she could not speak. She remembered arriving with 2 suitcases, sleeping on a folding cot, and wondering whether she had made the worst mistake of her life. She remembered the ruined wheat scattered across the floor. She remembered the bank officer telling her that sentiment was not a business plan, and she remembered her former husband saying that, at her age, she should choose security instead of risking another failure. Margaret reached into her pocket and took out her father's old iron key. "When I came here," she said, "I thought this mill was the only thing I had left." She looked toward the people who now worked beside her. But I was wrong. It was not what I had left. It was what I had been given the chance to rebuild. She nodded to Walter. He pulled the lever. Water rushed into the restored channel. Outside, the great wheel shuddered, turned once, then began moving steadily. Inside, the main shaft rotated. Belts tightened, gears engaged, and the grinding stones came alive. The building filled with the deep rhythm of work. Above the office door, Margaret hung her father's original sign. She did not recover the house she had lost. She built something that no one could take from her. At 61, Margaret had not started again with nothing. She had started with experience, courage, and a forgotten inheritance waiting for someone strong enough to believe in it. As the first fresh flour fell into the wooden bin, Margaret smiled. The mill was alive again, and so was she.